Top 8 Shocking Disappearances Solved by Psychic Detectives. A psychic detective helps in the investigation of crimes using paranormal psychic abilities. Many supposed psychics have claimed to have helped to their psychic abilities by assisting the police in disappearance and murder cases. Here are 8 cases where psychics provided essential details to solve the case. 1. Nell Cropsey. On the night of November 20, 1901, a young woman named Ella Ann Cropsey, called Nell by her family and friends, disappeared from her home in Elizabeth City. 37 days later, her body was found floating in the Pasquotank River. Despite the man having been convicted of her murder, many questions about her death remain unanswered. And some say that her uneasy spirit still haunts her home in Elizabeth City. The Cropsey family had moved to Elizabeth City in 1898, from Brooklyn, New York. Young Nell Cropsey was a beautiful woman from a wealthy family, and in her new home she was soon attracting the attention of suitors. Nell began being courted by a local man named Jim Wilcox. At the time of her disappearance, Wilcox and Cropsey had been courting for nearly 3 years, and it's said that Nell was growing impatient with Jim Wilcox's hesitancy to propose marriage. Nell Cropsey began flirting with other men in public in an attempt to spur Wilcox into proposing. But her plan seems to have gone awry. On the evening of November 20, 1901, Cropsey and Wilcox had an argument. The fight was loud, and everyone in the household could hear that the two lovers were yelling at one another, even if what they were saying couldn't be understood. Some of Nell's family who were in the house at the time did say that she and Wilcox had tentatively made up by the end of the evening, but no one ever learned where the lovers stood at the end of that night. When Nell Cropsey stepped outside the door with Wilcox around 11 that night, it was the last time she was ever seen alive. Ollie Cropsey, Nell's sister, heard something bang against the back of the house shortly after Jim Wilcox left. Going out to investigate, she found that the screen door had been broken. She saw no sign of who or what had broken the door. Ollie Cropsey went upstairs to see if Nell was already in bed, but found her sister's room empty. Uneasy about her sister's absence, she nevertheless returned to her own room and attempted to sleep. Shortly thereafter, a neighbor woke the entire house. The neighbor was yelling that someone was trying to steal the Cropseys' pig. The entire family rushed downstairs, where they found the front door hanging wide open. And the entire family realized that Nell was not there. Jim Wilcox's umbrella, a gift from Nell, was standing inside the door. No one had noticed it there earlier that night. When morning came and Nell Cropsey was still missing, the hunt began in earnest. The police were summoned and the entire town was searched high and low. But no trace of Nell was found. Suspicion for Nell's disappearance immediately fell on Jim Wilcox, who maintained that he had no idea what had happened to her. This wasn't good enough for the police. Wilcox was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and held in the local jail. With Wilcox sitting in gaol and Nell still missing, the family remained in limbo. This ended on the night of December 27th, more than a month after Nell's disappearance. Mrs. Cropsey spotted something floating in the Pasquotank River near the family home. Sending some boatmen out to investigate, she crushingly realized that her long vigil was over. What she had seen floating in the river was her daughter's body. In one of the most astounding occurrences in the case, a few days before Nell's body was discovered, the family had received a letter with a New York postmark containing what claimed to be a detailed account of the events of the night of Nell's disappearance. The letter stated that Nell Cropsey had interrupted a vagrant attempting to steal the family pig. Upon being discovered, the man grabbed a heavy stick and knocked Nell unconscious. The unknown man carried Nell down to the river and stole a convenient boat. He rowed out into the river and dumped Nell Cropsey in the Pasquotank. The letter included a map which marked the spot where the body could be found. The spot marked on the map was very close to where Nell Cropsey's body was eventually discovered. Who sent this letter and if the events it recounts for what truly happened that night remain unknown to this day. With the discovery of Cropsey's body, the town went mad. A lynch mob descended on the gaol, demanding Wilcox be released into their hands. Nell's parents refused to join the mob, and pleaded with the crowd to let justice be served in the courts. Eventually, Governor Aycock sent in a small Naval Reserve group to disperse the crowd. Wilcox was tried twice for Cropsey's murder. At the first trial he was found guilty, But this conviction was overturned when the NC Supreme Court declared a mistrial. A second trial convicted Wilcox on a charge of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. At neither trial did Wilcox take the stand in his own defense. Wilcox was pardoned by Governor Thomas Pickett in 1920. To the end of his life, Wilcox maintained his innocence. Shortly before his death in 1932, Wilcox spoke with W.O. Saunders, the editor of the Elizabeth City newspaper, and revealed everything he knew about the murder. Saunders walked away from the interview convinced Wilcox was innocent, and planned to publish the full details. 2 weeks after that interview, Jim Wilcox committed suicide. Saunders died shortly thereafter in a car accident. Whatever Wilcox had told Saunders would now never be heard. For the past century, those who have lived in the Cropsey home have reported strange happenings. Lights have gone on and off by themselves, doors open and shut of their own accord, and strange gusts of cold air move through the house. The pale figure of a young woman has also been seen moving through the house. Many people passing by on the street outside have reported seeing the ghostly figure of a girl looking out of an upstairs window. Residents even say that the figure of Nell Cropsey has appeared in their bedrooms at night. Is the unfortunate victim of one of North Carolina's most famous and sensational murder cases still wandering through her home in Elizabeth City? Will the true facts surround Nell Cropsey's murder ever be known? This enduring mystery has become part of the living history of Elizabeth City, and no visit to this quiet coastal town is complete without a walk by the Cropsey home. How to get there? The Cropsey home is located at 1901 Riverside Drive in Elizabeth City. This home is a private residence, but is occasionally open to the public on special occasions, including the annual Elizabeth City Ghost Walk. 2. Maria Scott. Maria Scott called the 43 hectares at Robertson in the Southern Highlands her little piece of heaven. From time to time, the prostitute would tell her friends in Port Kembla that she had been out to a rehabilitation center at Robertson. This is the Triple Care Farm Youth Rehabilitation Center, set on the scenic Illawarra Escarpment. On October 30, 2003, the 27-year-old's badly decomposed body was found wrapped in a quilt and dumped in bushland on the farm. She had been stabbed twice in the chest, twice in her abdomen and once in the back. Her body was so badly decomposed that police could not determine if she had suffered any other injuries before she died, and her time of death was set at anywhere between 2 months and a year before she was found. In the 8 months between the last confirmed sighting of M. Scott and the grisly find by teenagers living at the farm, police were inundated with false leads and accused of not doing enough to find M. Scott because she was an Aboriginal prostitute. At one stage police had multiple persons of interest to investigate, but their information was received from people making vindictive allegations. There was a perception among the Port Kembla community that police were not acting fast enough, and some took matters into their own hands, brutally assaulting a man alleged to have information about M. Scott. M. Scott's mother, Josephine Cross, demanded answers in the 41.5 years between her daughter's body being found and an inquest into the circumstances of her death held this week at Albion Park Courthouse. Again, Ms. Cross blamed her daughter's Aboriginal heritage and profession for the perceived lack of action. Ms. Cross had reported her daughter missing on March 24, 2003, one day after police had received a report that she had been killed. Ms. Cross had come from Merriwaga, near Griffith, to find M. Scott. The last time she'd spoken to her, M. Scott had asked her mother to come to Port Kembla and help her get her 2 children back. "Maria and I had a disagreement over the drugs," Ms. Cross said, "mainly for her own safety. She said, 'Will you help me get my children back?' And I said, 'If you get off the drugs, I will.' And I would have." Ms. Cross said she regretted not looking for her daughter sooner. Very soon after M. Scott was reported missing, rumors began circulating in Port Kembla as to what had happened to her. Police were flooded with rumors and theories, some bizarre and often inconsistent. Police initially had 29 persons of interest to investigate, and Deputy State Coroner Paul McMahon said this week many allegations were made against third parties out of malice and jealousy. M. Scott's former de facto partner and the father of one of her 2 children, Jason Marr, was investigated as M. Scott had contact with him not long before she disappeared. She had won some money on poker machines, but it seemed the more people who heard about her win, the bigger the prize money became, rising from $1,700 to about $5,000. There was evidence M. Scott had given Marr some of her winnings, and M's Cross's barrister Jane Healy suggested to the coroner that M. Scott and Marr had argued about that money. In his findings, Mr. McMahon said, Jason Marr was a violent person and had engaged in acts of violence towards M. Scott. Ms. Healy had told the inquest a statement made to police suggested M. Scott had died at one of Marr's relatives' homes when Marr hit her too hard during an argument. Police and Mr. McMahon eliminated this theory as there was no way to connect Marr with Triple Care Farm. Another statement to police alleged M. Scott had been killed in the back of a Port Kembla sex shop. In July 2003, Jeffrey Marr Jr. was one of a group of men who kidnapped and brutally interrogated a man who they alleged had information about the whereabouts of M. Scott. The men believed the potential suspect had M. Scott's handbag. When M. Scott's body was discovered in October, police focused their attention on staff and residents at Triple Care Farm. Her body was found about 50 meters from Warta Lodge. M. Scott's blood was found on the wall near a light switch in the cottage, and evidence of larger pools of blood were found, but because it had been cleaned, the blood could not positively be identified as that of M. Scott. When she disappeared, Mark Brown was the only person living in Warta Lodge. His former girlfriend, former co-workers and others who knew him gave evidence at the inquest that he was a private person who kept to himself and did not like to talk about his troubled past. Ex-girlfriend Paula Black told the inquest Brown assaulted her on 2 occasions, headbutting her on 1 occasion and repeatedly hitting her on another. She showed the court the dent on her forehead caused by Brown headbutting her. Mr. McMahon described Brown's attacks on Ms. Black as vicious and prolonged. The observable injury Ms. Black still carries is a testament to the ferocity of his attack on her, he said. It seemed common knowledge among Triple Care Farm staff that Brown smoked marijuana, and his colleague John Stewart said Brown cultivated plants in the bush not far from where M. Scott's body was found. Ms. Healy asked the coroner to make a recommendation about Triple Care Farm which bans the use of drugs by residents and staff. The coroner refused to make any recommendation as its barrister Stephen Woods argued the farm had not been prepared to fight any claims about its drug policy during the inquest. Mission Australia owns the farm, and its state director, Lenny Green, said she was not in a position to comment on Brown and his drug use. She said the farm had a zero-tolerance drugs policy and she did not want the inquest to overshadow the farm's good work. When Mr. Stewart heard about M. Scott's body being found on the farm, he immediately contacted police. I thought maybe Mark had something to do with it, he said. Mr. Stewart said Brown was known to regularly use the services of Port Kembla prostitutes. Mr. McMahon found on Thursday that Brown killed M. Scott on or about March 2, 2003. Brown was on stress leave and he was still living at the farm, but he did not have work duties to occupy his time. His doctor cleared him to return to work on March 25, but within days he resigned and moved to Brisbane. He returned to Robertson, but on June 4 he killed himself at Carrington Falls, just a few minutes' drive from where M. Scott's body was found, in her little piece of heaven. 3. Paula Brown. 3 days after hairdresser Paula Brown's battered body was found in bushland at Port Botany, a man walked into Maroubra police station. He would only give his name as Martin, but he suggested they check the DCM nightclub in Oxford Street, as people there were involved in the drugging and raping of women. 6 years later, Martin Tredgebull was revealed yesterday as the final person of interest to police in the case. The house painter from Pagewood faced the coroner's hearing, after an exhaustive police investigation of hundreds of tip-offs eliminated other suspects in Ms. Brown's murder early on Saturday morning, May 4, 1996. Before the deputy state coroner, Jackie Millage, Mr. Tredgebull refusing 9 times to answer questions, on legal advice that it might incriminate him. Ms. Brown, 30, had been out on the town with workmates. She had drunk at least 6 glasses of champagne and 5 of white wine, and was so inebriated she had difficulty holding up her head. Her fiancé, David Rayner, said she was happy, bubbly and friendly. She loved life. She had no enemies. After her disappearance from Oxford Street, Darlinghurst, mannequins and models dressed in her distinctive clothing, A zebra print miniskirt, black lace shirt, black stockings and black platform shoes, flushed out witnesses who helped trace her last hours. Her body was found 8 days later. She had been killed by multiple blows to the head, had bruising on her chest and neck and a bite on her left breast. There was a strong suggestion she had been attacked sexually. On oath, Mr. Tredgebull said he knew nothing about the death. "Where were you the night of Friday, May 3rd, and the morning of Saturday, May 4th, 1996? Asked counsel assisting, Philip Bolton. "On legal advice I can't answer that question," Mr. Tredgebull replied. "It may incriminate." "Did you from time to time frequent Oxford Street at night?" "On legal advice, I can't answer." "Have you ever been to the car park on Penryn Road, Port Botany, near to where Miss Brown's body was found?" "I can't answer that question." "My legal advice, it might incriminate me." Ms. Millett refused a request to suppress Mr. Tredgebull's name and evidence, saying the inquest was part of the continuing investigation, and that naming him and publication of the proceedings may produce further evidence. The officer in charge, Detective Sergeant Michael Fitzgerald, said more than 200 leads were followed, including questioning ship's crews in Honolulu and Hong Kong. A security guard was hypnotized to identify the number plate of a suspicious car. He described a profile prepared of the attacker, white male, mid-20s to mid-30s. The motive of the crime was sex. The murder was done in a fit of rage indicated by the 3 blows to the head. He was quick-tempered, with a history of violence. He is used to getting his own way with women. Only 2 people had met the profile. One, a drug dealer, had been eliminated as a suspect. That left Mr. Tredgebull. He lived 2 kilometers from where the body was found. At the time of the murder, he was bald. A motorist had described Ms. Brown giggling with a Caucasian bald man. Sergeant Fitzgerald was of the belief that Martin Tredgebull was involved in or has intimate knowledge in the murder. Ms. Brown's fiancé told the court he waited for her to arrive home on the last Manly ferry. "It's been 6 years since Paula has been gone. We just want to know how, and why, and who by. It's not going to bring her back, and nothing ever will." The psychic had used a grid map, plumb bob and some hair from the victim to help her state the location of the body. Though the body was found by chance, the police had acknowledged the accuracy of the information given by the clairvoyant. She was found less than 2 kilometers from the exact spot the psychic told the authorities. 4. Melanie Yerby. 31-year-old Melanie Yerby was a nurse at Pacoima Hospital in Burbank, California, and a divorced single mother of an 8-year-old son. On her way to work in her pickup truck, witnesses saw 2 men abduct her by forcing their way into her truck, while she was waiting at a stoplight. When she failed to turn up for her shift at Pacoima Hospital on the night of December 15, 1980, Melanie's employer telephoned her house but got no answer. She was considered reliable and punctual. Fearing the worst, the police were called. By the next morning they had found her pickup truck, burned out, and her nurse's uniform. The story of Melanie Yerby, her murder, and her murderers is somewhat overshadowed by the tale of the psychic vision that led to her body's whereabouts. On December 17, a 32-year-old shipping clerk at the Lockheed Aerospace plant named Eddie Smith heard about Melanie's disappearance on the radio and about the house searches the police were conducting. Immediately, despite not having any prior knowledge of the case, she thought to herself, "She's not in the house." As soon as that thought crossed her mind, she claims, she had a vision which was like a movie. Very, very clear, a canyon and a curving road, shrubbery, hills in the backdrop, and a dirt path leading to something white. Etta believed that the white might have been Melanie's uniform and that it was her body. The vision was a clue to the nurse's location. She didn't know the name of the place, but felt that she knew the way to the location. She did not consider herself a psychic. Nonetheless, she left work early to talk to the police. Detective Lee Ryan, despite his skepticism, felt that Etta was credible, noting her credentials as a businesswoman and her top security clearance, and he decided to see what she knew about Melanie's disappearance. Etta pinpointed the area where she believed Melanie's body would be found on a map, a remote part of the San Fernando Valley, Lopez Canyon, above Lakeview Terrace. She had a strong feeling that Melanie, dead or alive, was there, and an overwhelming urge to look for her as soon as possible. Fearing that she wasn't being taken seriously, Etta's recurring vision prompted her to search the area that same day with a few family members rather than wait for the police. Cruising slowly towards the top of canyon in her car, she felt a trauma, Melanie's presence, and became certain in her mind that Melanie was in the canyon. Deciding to drive down the canyon once more, she noticed fresh tire tracks, and she felt the same trauma, and she somehow knew that this vehicle was involved. Further down the canyon, they stopped again when Etta's daughter noticed something strange in the brush. Etta started going towards it and she saw a body with white nursing shoes, the landscape exactly as it had been in her visions. An autopsy determined that the body was indeed Melanie Yerby and that she had been robbed, stripped naked, raped, and beaten to death. Etta's vision as she had described it had been confirmed. However, Melanie's killers remained at large. Suspicion subsequently fell upon Etta. Inevitably, the evening after Melanie's body was discovered, Etta was arrested. Etta was questioned by detectives and they were legitimately suspicious about how Etta knew this about the case. After questioning Etta for several hours, they had her take a polygraph test. However, she failed it, and a detective's sworn testimony is that she was trying to be deceptive, even attempting to control her breathing. The police believed that, if she wasn't involved with the murderers, her information was coming from gossip in her neighborhood, or perhaps someone who had heard something but was afraid to come forward. They thought her motivation for claiming to have had a vision may have been for financial gain. While it could be more generously believed that she failed because the trauma of the vision and corpse-hunting excursion made her behave oddly, either way this left her as having intricate knowledge on the location of the body yet a very improbable claimed source of the knowledge. The next morning she was formally charged with murder. Shortly after Etta was charged with Melanie's murder, a police informant said that he had heard one of the killers bragging about the murder in his neighborhood. This man was arrested and confessed, implicating two more young men in the crime. Etta was released on December 21. Louis Carnell Morgan, 20, an unnamed 17-year-old, and Spencer Nelson, 21, were taken into custody. The trio had jumped into Ms. Uribe's truck at the stoplight and driven her into the canyon 15 miles north before robbing her, raping her and beating her to death while she begged for her life. The cause of death was blunt trauma from being hit over the head with a large rock. The killers were convicted and are serving time in prison. 5. Penny Sarah. Edward R. Grant fixed cars, went to church and raised two families as the 1973 murder of Concetta Penny Sarah in a downtown parking garage hardened into the city's most notorious unsolved homicide case. Grant on Friday was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison for stabbing the 21-year-old dental hygienist through the heart and leaving her to die. He'd been convicted in June with new DNA technology that tied him to a case that had seen 3 other suspects come and go. And for the first time, he heard the Sarah family's tortured cry. "You stole Penny from John, his first daughter. You sentenced him to life without parole. Why? You're a cold-blooded killer who made my family wait nearly 30 years for a measure of justice. Why?" Cousin Joseph Sarah said in remarks during the sentencing hearing, glaring at Grant across the New Haven courtroom. John Sarah died in 1998, trapped for the last 2 decades of his life in a single-minded quest to find his daughter's killer. He kept at it as the case bogged down in false leads, charges of political interference, and a 60 Minutes news investigation. His law enforcement contacts had told him they were closing in on another suspect, Ed Grant, but Sarah died less than 8 months before Grant's arrest. "If you had come forward 29 years ago, maybe I would not have had to look into my father's haunted eyes," said Rosemary Sarah, Penny Sarah's younger sister. "You turned time into our enemy. I've spent 70% of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if some acquaintance could have been the murderer. But the 59-year-old car mechanic from Waterbury wasn't about to provide the answers. In the face of DNA tests that say the chances were 1 in 6.9 trillion it wasn't his blood on a handkerchief found at the scene, he resolutely denied involvement. "I am sorry for the Sarah family's loss. But I had no part in this tragedy," said the small gray-haired man in a dark suit and leg shackles. His back was to the crowded courtroom gallery. On one side were his son, daughter and first and second wives. On the other, were Sarah's sister, cousin and a couple of the former police officers who'd worked the elusive case. Grant asked for leniency, but his denial seemed to inflame Superior Court Judge John C. Blue. The judge said the slaying was a mystery no longer. No one can deny that someone thrust a knife into her heart and left that beautiful young woman dead or dying in a dirty stairwell. No one can deny, Mr. Grant, by the evidence, brilliantly presented, that someone was you, Blue said in a voice that rang out in the courtroom. This shocking brutality, the lack of justification for the crime, and the refusal to accept responsibility or express remorse precludes leniency. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten your blood-stained hands, said Blue, quoting Shakespeare's Macbeth. He was referring to the statements from his family in court Friday that he was a loving father, a good neighbor, a gentleman. Later, after Blue passed the sentence that means Grant won't be considered for parole until he's 80 years old, Rosemary Sarah shook her head. I can't fathom how he has lived with himself. Has he pushed it so far back in his mind? Did he try to save his family from that emotional roller coaster? She wondered. On the day of the murder in 1973, Grant was a 30-year-old ex-serviceman and father of two who may have been in the New Haven area visiting the Veterans Administration Medical Center in West Haven. He'd been injured in a Jeep accident when he was serving in the National Guard in upstate New York and had steel plates implanted in his head. Sarah's attackers struggled with her and fled in her car after the stabbing. Her boyfriend, Phil DiNito, was briefly a suspect but never charged. A gruff baseball coach and substitute teacher named Anthony Galino was charged with the Sarah murder in 1984, mainly because he'd told his ex-wife that he'd do to her what he did to Sarah. A blood test cleared Galino on the eve of trial. In 1994, a judge rejected a warrant application for yet another suspect, Selman Topsy of Plano, Texas, a former patient in Sarah's dental office. In 1997, state police fingerprint expert Christopher Grice, using the latest technology, found new details in the bloody fingerprint on the tissue box. He ran the print against the state's file and found it matched the print of a man who'd been arrested a few years earlier in a domestic dispute in Waterbury. His name was Ed Grant. Blood samples from the murder scene and Grant were sent to a lab in Denver that was conducting the latest in DNA testing. They matched. 6. Patricia List. Patricia List was the 16-year-old daughter of John List. She was supposed to attend a rehearsal for an upcoming play but did not arrive. Ed Aliano, her drama coach, was worried about Patricia since she once told him that her father wanted to kill her. Ed decided to pay a visit to her student's house, and had asked the intervention of the police in the matter. The authorities had entered the house but found no one alive inside. John List had shot his mother and his wife, along with his 3 children, including Patricia List. John left a letter confessing the murder. On November 10, 1971, between 8:30 in the morning and 4 o'clock that afternoon, John List wiped out his entire family. Over breakfast, he shot his wife in the kitchen as she sipped her coffee, and his mother while she stood by a toaster holding a plate with a pat of butter on it. Around noon, he picked up his 16-year-old daughter, Patricia, from school and shot her in the head. Then he took a shower, drove to town, withdrew his mother's savings from the bank, and came home to ambush his 2 other children, Frederick, 13, and John Jr., 15. An economical man, John List knocked off 4 out of 5 of his kin using but a single shot each. Only John Jr. required extra bullets. John got hurt more, the boy's father explained in a confessional letter, because he seemed to struggle longer. Silly boy. As a genre, true crime usually means murder, most often among the middle class or the rich. John List was a bookkeeper. He lived in a house he couldn't afford in Westfield, NJ, a town that had not had a murder in 8 years. What is enthralling about his story, though, is not who, how many or why he killed, but what he did after he quit murdering people. Once he had arranged the bodies of his wife and children side by side in one room, Mr. List turned the central heating system down to a sensible 50 degrees, cool enough to preserve the bodies for a while, but warm enough to keep the pipes from bursting, wrote some confessional letters, switched on the radio so that classical music would fill the house, and then drove to Kennedy Airport. He parked his car in the long-term parking lot, locked the keys inside the car and flew west. The bodies weren't discovered for a month. By that time, John List had vanished into thin mountain air. He didn't get away with murder. After all, He had left behind letters announcing it was he who had done the deed. But he did get away. In Denver, the unburdened John List became Robert P. Clark, a fry cook with no past. People who disappear usually turn up. They write home or return to their old habits. Mr. List did better than most fugitives, but in time he began to pine for a better job, more money and busier hours. People started to notice how much he talked about accounting. Eventually, Bob Clark fell in love, got married and went back to keeping books. In 1989, 18 years after the murders, a sharp-eyed neighbor of Mr. List saw a wax model of him on the television program America's Most Wanted, and called in to report him. The FBI looked up Robert P. Clark. Discovering that he was a bookkeeper, the same age as List and educated in the same places, they knew they had their man. In jail he explained his reason for the murders. Before he wiped out his family, Mr. List had been in all kinds of trouble, mostly financial. The bookkeeper could not tolerate such chaos, and so he wiped the slate clean, as methodically as if he were erasing a column of figures. He told a psychiatrist, "There was no other solution. I killed them all so that no one would survive. It's like I had no control all the while I was doing it." Death Sentence is an original paperback, published fast and hard on the heels of John List's trial last May. The jury found Mr. List guilty. The judge imposed the maximum sentence, life in prison ×5, as true crime. The book is okay. The author Joe Sharkey is neither a particularly graceful writer nor a fabulously insightful one, but he gets the job done. Here is what John List has to say about the coup he pulled off. "I didn't really think I would get away with it for more than a week or two. I decided to stay free as long as I could. I might have had it in my mind to turn myself in, but I never gave it serious consideration. I was afraid of the consequences. I was afraid I would go to jail for a long time. Well, yes." 7. Edith Kugel Arias. It was February 1961, Washington's birthday. 4-year-old Edith Arias had taken the subway from her Brooklyn home with her widowed mother and brother to visit her uncle in Manhattan. Her uncle's apartment was on 8th Avenue near 18th Street, in the deteriorating neighborhood of Chelsea, as one newspaper described it at the time. Edith spent the afternoon playing outside on the sidewalk. Her uncle left her alone for a few minutes to buy cigarettes, and by the time he came back around 4 p.m., the little girl in a purple snowsuit had vanished. In an era without Amber Alerts or even 911, police seemed to pull out all the stops to find her. Over the next week, they set up special hotlines for anyone who may have seen her. They searched rooftops, sewers, and the bottom of the Hudson. Detectives leafed through records of mental hospitals for women recently released and checked death lists, reported the New York Times, as the police felt the person who took her might have a frustrated mother instinct. Gerard Croizet was a clairvoyant and had agreed to help in the investigation. However, he declined to go to the United States. He said that the bustle of New York would overwhelm him. Instead of going to the place of disappearance, he asked for the photograph of the child and a map. The following week, the vice president of KLM went and visited Croizet to provide the picture, map and some clothes of the child. After receiving the picture, map and clothes of the child, the clairvoyant was able to have visions of Edith and the description of his kidnapper. Croizet was able to provide some descriptions like dark woman sitting in front of a window, a gray building with 5 floors. On the 2nd floor, the dead child is there. The information was then passed to the New York Police Department, and on February 27, Edith's body was found on a bed in a one-room flat at 307 West 20th Street. At left today, a dingy Chelsea rooming house, as a front-page Times piece put it. She'd been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The killer was captured a few days later. Fred Thompson, a 59-year-old drifter who had just rented the room in the West 20th Street house. He admitted to cops that while in a drunken stupor, he lured Edith to his room by telling her that he had his own little girl she could play with. He assaulted and beat her, then left her in the room while he spent days drinking on the Bowery. When he learned that police had found Edith's body and that he was the prime suspect, he fled to Philadelphia and then to a New Jersey chicken farm. Assistant Chief Inspector James J. Walsh of the New York City Police said after questioning Thompson he had said, "I know I deserve my full punishment for what I did," the Times wrote. Asked what he meant by full punishment, Thompson was quoted as saying life imprisonment or the electric chair. Thompson was tried and found guilty later that year. The verdict carried a mandatory death sentence. But according to one source, Thompson, above, was instead institutionalized for the rest of his life. 8. Andre Daigle. Andre Daigle was last seen enjoying a game of pool and a beer when he was approached by a young woman who asked him to give her a lift home. 4 days later, the young man was reported missing by his family. The police did not take action because they thought that Andre was just taking a time out with the girl. Andre's sister, Elise McGinley of Fullerton, California, had gone to Rosemary Kerr, a clairvoyant, psychometrist and psychic detective. Elise had brought a picture and a map to Kerr and asked for the whereabouts of her brother. Kerr had vibrations on the picture and she saw that Andre was sitting in his truck. She also saw water, a long bridge and railroad tracks. She also felt terrible head pains that were so strong that she felt like they were killing her. For the map, she traced her hand on the map and felt a tingling sensation and stopped at the spot near Slidell. According to Dell, she saw that Andre was already dead, but she did not let Elise know. Instead, she told her to ask for help. Meanwhile, Andre's brother, who lived near Andre, was surprised to see his missing brother's truck ride by his house. He called the police immediately and the chase was on. When the truck was cornered in the Pearl River near the Slidell, the killers were arrested. A murder trial in this suburban New Orleans town took a strange twist last week when a California psychic testified that she helped crack a Louisiana homicide case last June from her home 2,000 miles away. The trial ended Friday when the defendant, Michael Phillips, 22, of Kenner, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. But the highlight of testimony came Thursday, when Rosemary Kerr took the stand to tell how she helped solve the murder of Andre Daigle of River Ridge. With a jury of 9 women and 3 men listening in the courtroom of Judge Clarence McManus, Kerr said she led Daigle's family to his missing truck near Slidell. The truck had belonged to the victim and been driven away by the 2 men later charged with Daigle's death. Kerr, of Cypress, California, said that since then, she has communicated several times with the spirit of Daigle, a 27-year-old house renovator. She said Daigle has told her that his family should forgive the people who beat and strangled him before dumping his body in a swamp near Manchac. Kerr said she has relayed Daigle's spirit message to the large Daigle family of River Ridge. Some family members have not been exactly that forgiving, she testified. Kerr, whose business card describes her as a clairvoyant, medium, psychometrist and psychic investigator, said she had never been to New Orleans before arriving this week for Phillips' trial. Elise McGinley, of Fullerton, California, testified that after learning of her brother's disappearance in Jefferson Parish, she went to Kerr on the night of June 13 upon the advice of a co-worker. Kerr said she closed her eyes and placed a finger on the picture that McGinley furnished. Introduced into evidence, it was a snapshot of Andre and his 2 brothers. I was moving across the picture for vibrations, Kerr testified. She said she then could picture Daigle in his truck sitting beside a man with long blonde hair. She said she saw water, a long bridge with railroad tracks, and I felt terrible pain in my head and a voice was saying, "My head is killing me." She also closed her eyes and moved a finger on a map of the state. "I felt a tingling and I stopped," she said. Her finger stopped near Slidell. "I told Elise she should get someone to that area as quick as possible," she said. Kerr testified that at the time she actually knew that Daigle was dead. "But I could not tell his sister then. I knew she would have to be prepared for the death," she said. Charles Gervais, the other man found in Daigle's stolen truck when it was stopped by Pearl River police near Slidell, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison before Phillips' trial. At the time of his arrest, Gervais told authorities he and Phillips killed Daigle as a test of nerves. They also needed to kill to get a vehicle and money for guns.